All right. Good morning, everybody. This is Paul Lewis with the ENO Center for Transportation. Welcome to the webinar. Today we're going to be discussing aviation workforce challenges in the United States and the United Kingdom. For those new to our webinar series, ENO is a nonprofit independent think tank based in Washington, D.C. We cover all different modes and all different aspects of transportation, and we've been doing so for almost 100 years. And throughout our history, workforce has been one of those issues that continues to be front and center. And now and today, it's becoming even more of an issue with constrained labor markets, new skills, and increased demands on the workforce. This particular study that we're going to be talking about today is the result of some work that ENO conducted with the British Embassy on workforce issues in the aviation sector. And one of the things that we all know, but we don't always think about, is that aviation has a tremendously wide range of occupations that are necessary to support it. Pilots, controllers, engineers, construction workers, manufacturers, repairers, attendants, service workers, all of those professions are vital to keeping the airspace and aviation system functioning and functioning safely. This study is one of the first times that all of those occupations and their current issues were reviewed and consolidated into one document. The point of the research was really to try and gather some of the disparate information and bring it all into one single source. The next step is to find some recommendations and some policy actions for folks on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean to resolve some of the major challenges facing the workforce. This webinar is part of that phase where we're looking for some ideas and some thoughts on how to move forward. We're going to spend the next 45 minutes or so reviewing the paper and talking through some of the recommendations. We've invited some folks to the webinar that have some extensive experience in workforce issues. So for the next 45 minutes or so, we'll be having an open discussion about it. During the webinar, if anyone has any questions, we will have a question and answer phase to this. Please use the question function on your webinar toolbox. We will be getting to all those questions in a moment, but we're going to start. My colleague, Brianne Eby, she's a policy analyst here with me at ENO. She'll be presenting the paper. She was the lead researcher on the paper. She brings a tremendous amount of experience to ENO. She has degrees in psychology, environmental studies, and she was also at the Brookings Institution before she came to ENO. We have two other experts on the webinar. We've invited Jade Harford. She is the head of aviation skills and gender workforce at the UK Department for Transport. Jade has 8 years experience as a civil servant working in the UK government across several different policies and in varying different roles. In her current role, she supports the development of policies to address the skills shortage across the aviation sector and to help deliver government's aviation strategies and objectives to develop innovation, technology, and skills. We're also joined by Seth Young. Seth Young is the director of the Ohio State University Center for Aviation Studies. He has 20 years of experience in academia and industry, looking at issues of airport planning, capacity and delay estimation, landside operations, security policies, engineering, and financing of airports. Dr. Young has been with the Ohio State University since 2008. So without further ado, I'm going to hand the webinar over to Brianne Eby, who's going to walk through the research, some of the things that we found, and some of our key findings. For those that want more information on the research, it is available for free download on ENO's website, so you can check it out there. But without further ado, Brianne, take it away.
Okay, thanks very much, Paul, and thank you everybody for joining today. So by way of background into the topic of this research, I'll start by saying that aviation as an industry, is experiencing a lot of the same workforce challenges that other industries are facing right now. So you can think of things like impending retirements, the arrival of new technologies and automation, as well as competition within and between industries, and also, as the subject of this webinar is today, across countries. These are all factors that the aviation industry are contending with that are also affecting other industries. Likewise, recruiting the next generation of workers has also become a challenge for employers, and so we'll dig into some of those details in the webinar today. Now, the U.S. and the U.K. are the largest and third largest aviation markets in the world, respectively. In recent years, each has witnessed unique geopolitical stresses that have compounded existing workforce challenges. So in the U.S., of course, we just came out of a 35-day partial government shutdown, which affected two professions in aviation in particular, so air traffic controllers and TSA screeners. And in this case, many of the workers' paychecks were withheld, and for air traffic controllers, the training facility was temporarily shuttered. In the UK, of course, the results of Brexit may have implications for aviation-based trade or individuals' travel behaviors. And so in both countries, the lasting effects of these geopolitical matters are unknown, and it'll be interesting to see how these factors kind of have long-term implications on the workforce. While there have been some efforts in the education community or among policymakers to address these challenges, to date, there is really a lack in robust policy solutions. Addressing workforce needs across the aviation industry will, to some degree, require trade-specific solutions to accommodate educational skill requirements of the variety of professions under the aviation umbrella. It'll also require collaborative solutions between policymakers and the education, labor, and aviation industries. And again, we'll get into some of what that might look like. And I'm curious to hear from Jade and Seth if they have examples of what they're seeing as potential solutions and collaborative solutions specifically. So as Paul said, this report sought to synthesize workforce challenges in the aviation industry in the United States and in the UK, and it can serve as a tool for those looking to devise solutions. So we'll get into some of our methods here. So we did primarily a document analysis. So we looked at academic, industry, government, and news reports for this research, really trying to get a view across all fields and a wide variety of sources for our scan here. We conducted a synthesis of existing literature on aviation workforce challenges in both countries. Much of the reporting that exists right now comes from a variety of sources, but it's often segmented by occupation and doesn't synthesize across the entire industry. So thus, we decided to design the report around 6 major occupations. So we'll look a little bit closer into professional pilots, air traffic controllers, air maintenance and repair, aircraft maintenance and repair, airport workers, flight attendants, and aerospace manufacturing in the course of this webinar today. For each of these professions, we, in some cases, would look into case studies of experimental or effective industry practices. So for some professions, we, took a deeper dive into some existing scenarios of potential solutions, and these were a mix of industry, governmental, and educational initiatives. So you can find more details on those in the report if you're curious to see those. Something else we did was put together workforce characteristic comparison tables between the two countries. So for each occupation, we put together a table to summarize the average demographics and other characteristics of that workforce. So for example, we looked at the percent of women or percent of white workers or the average pay overall and by sex, the average age, and projected job growth for each profession. So this allowed for a comparison to be made between the two countries, but there were also some notable challenges through this process. We were pulling the data from available public government sources, so the FAA here in the US, Bureau of Labor Statistics, Office of National Statistics in the UK, but this meant that the data were not wholly consistent between the two countries, or that there were often gaps in the data, which made it hard to form comparisons. For example, the way that these jobs were classified was in some instances different between the two countries. So In the US, mechanics were labeled as aircraft and avionics equipment mechanics and technicians, whereas in the UK, this field was labeled as aircraft maintenance and related trades. So there might be some inconsistencies in what the data even are talking about in terms of the professions. In addition, there was ethnic and gender information for the US, for which there was not comparable information provided for the UK. And you can see that in this table, the example of pilot and flight engineers here from the paper. For the US, there were also inconsistencies in some of the information that was provided by the Census Bureau's American Community Survey versus the Bureau of Labor Statistics in their Occupational Outlook Handbook. And so for some of the tables, we had to provide a couple of numbers to kind of get at the disparity in the information that was provided. And so that's just one caveat from the process here, but we thought that this was a useful tool to compare the demographics across countries. So take a look at those in the paper. So I'll dig in now to each of the professions in turn, starting with professional airline pilots. So there's a common media narrative that there is a clear pilot shortage, though the evidence is actually mixed in practice. In June 2018, the International Air Transport Association projected an acceleration in hiring this year, and air travel demand in general is expected to increase, especially in the Asia-Pacific region. So Boeing recently projected a need for 127,000 and 118,000 pilots, respectively, in the US and UK, and about twice that demand for pilots in the Asia-Pacific region. As indication of increasing competition from the global market, a major UK flight training school recently estimated that up to 20% of the qualifying trainees are not EU citizens, and upon receiving licenses, they gain employment in their home countries. So that kind of gets at some of the international competition here. And it should also be noted that there is a unique challenge within the pilot profession of the required retirement age of 65 in both the US and the UK. So that creates some kind of retirement pressures there. There's much precedent for prioritizing safety in aviation, though of course we're all familiar with the recent Boeing issues, but there still is, quite a bit of safety regulatory and training standards in both countries for pilot training and qualifications. In the US, undergraduate degrees coupled with flight training can cost up to $200,000 in addition to certification costs. And in the UK, trainees must take a course to obtain an airline transport pilot's license, which can be obtained in 18 months and costs up to £90,000 in total. By some estimates, the entire cost of training in the UK can reach up to £120 for pilots. Pilots in the UK must also achieve certifications to fly a particular type of aircraft, and this is called a type rating. Entry-level wages for pilots can be lower than wages in other industries, typically between $20,000 and $40,000 in the US and £20,000 and £30,000 in the UK. However, once pilots advance to senior positions, captains at major commercial airlines, wages can grow to an average of $214,000 in the US and £140,000 in the UK. Recently, wages at all levels have begun to increase, though. There have been a number of examples of pilots striking for better wages in recent years. At the same time, regional carriers have been providing higher starting salaries, and airlines have offered attractive signing bonuses. However, this has made it harder for regional airlines to compete. Smaller cities that are served by these carriers could start to lose service if wages continue to rise, which may hamper these carriers' positions as feeders and training grounds for major airlines. Historically, the military was a robust source of hires for airlines. Today in the U.S., only a third of airline pilots have a background in military aviation, compared to over 80% in the 1960s. The military itself is also experiencing a shortfall, whereas in the 60s, pilots were required to serve 4 years upon certification in the military. Today, they're required to serve 10 years and are met with bonuses of up to $455,000 for signing for an additional 13-year military commitment. Perversely, this might actually work in private carriers' favor, as military-trained pilots can choose to secure their pension after 20 years of service and then move to the private sector for a higher salary. We'll move on next to air traffic controllers. So strict training requirements and federal budget shortfalls have created unique workforce pressures for air traffic controllers in the U.S. In both countries, only one primary employer for the TC workforce. In the US, this is the federal government. There was an unsuccessful attempt in the 115th Congress to spin ATC control out of the Federal Aviation Administration and into a separate independent nonprofit entity. This was supported by a broad coalition of industry associations, airlines, manufacturers, and airports as a way to insulate the workforce from federal political infighting, as past examples of budget sequesters have resulted in controller furloughs and halted training. And in light of this winter's partial government shutdown, during which the air traffic controllers were required to work without pay for 2 pay periods, this conversation of creating an independent ATC authority has been revived. The UK, on the other hand, has used a private sector governance model for air traffic controllers since 1996, when the Civil Aviation Authority created a government-owned corporation for the National Air Traffic Service. In 2001, this model was restructured to a public-private partnership where airlines own 46%, employees own 5%, and the national government owns 49% of the organization. NATS has 2 main service divisions, one that provides civilian en route ATC services and one that competes or contracts in the free market to provide ATC at UK and overseas airports. As a P3, NATS has greater autonomy to make its own capital and investment decisions and create workforce initiatives while retaining partial government ownership and oversight. In the US, there are minimum requirements to become an air traffic controller, including citizenship, security screenings, language skills. Applicants must be at least 18, but no more than 30 years old when the application is submitted, and they're required to retire by 56, similar to the pilot age cap. On the job, training occurs over 17 weeks at the FAA Controller Academy in Oklahoma City. And after that point, trainees become certified controllers and can operate independently. In 2016, the president of the National Air Traffic Controllers Association pointed to a 27-year low for certified professional controller staffing. Baseline requirements are similar but slightly less rigid in the UK, so similar age requirements. However, they were previously required to be under 35 years old, but a 2006 age discrimination regulation called this practice unlawful. In the UK, few applicants are successful becoming controllers, averaging 15 new hires per 3,300 applications. The nature of air traffic control technology is evolving, so both the US and UK are implementing multi-year plans to modernize their systems, including replacing paper strips with digital technology. So that's something that controllers will need to be trained on into the future. We'll move on next to the aircraft maintenance, repair, and overhaul workforce. So lower fuel prices, operational efficiencies, and rising demand for air travel have led to record profits for manufacturers in recent years. Airlines have demonstrated willingness to spend more on the upkeep of the existing aircraft, resulting in the delayed retirement of older jets. In a 2017 Aeronautical Repair Station Association survey, 55% of respondents reported having unfilled maintenance technician positions, yet 82% pointed to at least some level of difficulty in finding qualified workers to fill these open positions. This has led, in some cases, to a concern about workforce bleed, or the idea that certified graduates pursue careers in other fields for higher wages or better working conditions. While training costs aren't particularly prohibitive for this trade, compensation is also lower than it is for pilots or ATCs. In the US, it's estimated that only 60% of aviation maintenance students take the FAA mechanic certification test, and among those who do, 20% of graduates pursue careers in fields outside of aviation. Decreased enrollment in maintenance programs is part of a broader shift across industries toward decreased interest for technical education among younger generations. At the primary and high school levels, there's been increased emphasis on core academic areas, as well as societal expectations that students should pursue traditional 4-year degrees. In response, calls have been made to modernize MRO curriculum, experiment with new training styles, and to increase funding to MRO programs. Next, we'll move on to airport workers. So the section on airport workers was a bit more of a challenge to write, as we were comparing not only between the two countries, but also across a broad swath of professions. They comprise everything from security screeners to IT professionals to food concessionaires and financial professionals. So it's hard to generalize across such a wide-ranging set of job categories and thus inform policy solutions. So in this report, we chose to highlight challenges that are unique to jobs that don't require a college education, which represent the majority of airport jobs and also the lowest wage earners. As demand for air travel grows, the number of airport jobs will need to grow in order to meet increasing passenger volumes. Public policy in the U.S. has made it hard for airports to recruit workers. Over 50,000 TSA screeners, who are among the lowest paid federal employees, were among the federal workforce to be affected by the recent government shutdown. And so, again, as I said before, that could have long-term effects. Some fear that automation will eliminate the need for manual labor, and there's been speculation that soon passengers will travel from the curb to the plane without interacting with a single airline employee. While the effects of automation on demand for workers is unknown, some have countered fears of job loss by stating that automation will instead free employees to personally assist passengers. Average salaries tend to be low in this group of workers, with the starkest wage decline felt among bellhops and baggage porters in the U.S. Wages are even lower among tipped workers like wheelchair attendants, who earned $5.95 per hour in 2017. However, wages and benefits do seem to be improving in response to labor efforts. And so, for example, workers at Aberdeen International Airport recently rejected a wage increase below inflation, and similar effects were found at Reagan National Airport here in the U.S. I'll next move on to flight attendants. So in recent years, some airlines have had up to hundreds of thousands of applicants apply for far fewer open positions, resulting in fewer than 1% being hired. And it's been stated that the odds of being admitted to an Ivy League school are higher than being selected as a flight attendant. This rigor is in part due to safety expertise that the candidates must have, and recruitment can take weeks or even months of interviews and on-site trainings. Again, with growing demand for air travel, there's an estimate needed increase in cabin crew members, especially in the Asia-Pacific region, but also in Europe and North America. In 2017, over 3,200 Unite the Union members in the UK engaged in strikes exceeding 80 days against British Airways over low pay and company discipline against workers who had previously engaged in collective bargaining. Similar organizations events have happened here in the U.S. In both countries, the majority of flight attendants are women, and the industry does struggle with a history of sexual assault. So that's another thing that we explore in greater detail in the paper. I'll move on next to the aerospace manufacturing workforce. So the International Air Transport Association recently estimated that air travel would grow to 7.8 billion passengers per year by 2036. While maintaining existing aircraft is important to managing this demand, there will also be a need for additional aircraft. A recent Outlook report by the management consulting firm Oliver Wyman projected an annual growth of 3.7% between 2018 and 2028 for aerospace manufacturing. However, the manufacturing industry is also subject to external forces. So obviously the two recent tragic crashings of Boeing planes could have an effect on this industry, and then similarly the effects of Brexit. However, also threats of a trade war in the U.S. have had cooling effects on U.S. Aviation manufacturing, and competition from companies abroad may challenge the duopoly of Boeing and Airbus. So I will next get into the broad takeaways before we turn to our guest speakers here, and I'll go through these pretty quickly. So takeaway number one is that the aviation industry suffers from workforce pipeline challenges rather than personnel shortages. So the outlook on whether shortages exist across aviation occupations is unclear and mixed, depending on the specific occupation. Low unemployment among pilots and aircraft mechanics may signal a tight labor market, while among air traffic controllers in the U.S., a legitimate concern about staffing shortages exists and has for some time. However, what is often framed as a workforce shortage among other occupations may actually be widespread pipeline issues. That is, difficulty filling available positions. Takeaway number two, so as technology that's currently under development, as we look to this, it could replace some job functions across all of these occupations that we've explored, but the degree to which jobs will be replaced outright is unknown. Rather, technology will likely change the nature of jobs. Manufacturing and maintenance jobs are beginning to rely more on advanced electronics and computing, while ATCs will need to adjust to a system based on GPS instead of radar. And the workforce will need to be trained to keep up with these skills. Moving on to takeaway number three. So things like succession planning and leadership development training can reduce the loss of institutional knowledge as older employees retire. In both the US and the UK, most aviation professions are dominated by white, with the exception of airport service jobs, and male, with the exception of flight attendants workers. The industry as a whole needs to foster an environment that is attractive to a broader population. Moving on to takeaway number 4. So in the wake of September 11th, 2001, there was restricted hiring and personnel development. Numerous bankruptcies, airline consolidations, and the global economic recession also restricted hiring and development. Now, as travel demand grows and airlines experience record profit, the industry is beginning to increase wages to attract workers. And finally, takeaway number 5 here is that the aviation industry is competing both with other professions, well, threefold, I guess, other professions, other countries, and with itself for its future workforce. So as opportunities in STEM-based occupations grow, aviation will need to compete with the medical, engineering, and tech sectors for workers. The increased outsourcing of occupations to other countries as a means to cut costs and regulations, preventing foreign students from working in the country in which they were trained, and thus returning to their home countries, are manifestations of external competition to the industry. There's also competition within the industry itself. For example, among pilots, airlines are increasingly drawing personnel from military, private, and regional positions. So with that, I think we'll turn it to Jade Harford from the UK Department for Transport for any feedback that you have on our findings from the report, or any unique solutions that you're seeing in the UK. Go ahead, Paul.
Yeah, no, Jade, we're going to turn it over. We're going to get some reactions both to the paper and then kind of some perspectives on how government should react to some of these findings, both from Jade and Seth. But Jade, if you want to kick it off, that'd be great.
Great. Thank you, Brianne, and thank you for inviting me today to speak on this report. Just as a sort of headline, when I was recruited into this role, my immediate priority was to create a skills package for the UK government aviation 2050 strategy, which is currently out for consultation. And as I provide some thoughts on this report, I'll lean a lot on that piece of work. Coming into this role again, sort of last year, I was getting a lot of information and evidence from industry, which was fantastic. But there were sort of key pieces missing in terms of causal and correlation evidence. There was a lot of anecdotal information. And that's part and parcel because of the breadth of the aviation sector and the professions and getting all that information together. So this report is hugely helpful in bridging that gap and really understanding the different corners of the aviation sector and the makeup of it. I'm going to focus my comments on some of the key areas around pilots, air traffic controllers, ATCOs, MROs, and diversity and technology. So I think in the report there was a question around whether there's a true pilot shortage, and I think there's definitely a growing demand for pilots. I don't tend to say shortage, I tend to say demand. From a UK perspective, passenger numbers have been increasing for 7 consecutive years now. We estimate that passenger traffic could soar from 284 million last year to about 435 million by 2050. So that's quite a big jump over the next couple of years. The main barrier to commercial pilot training, which is alluded to in the report and what I hear a lot from industry, is around the cost. So as part of our strategy here, we're looking at the VAT model because VAT is applied to training, coupled with industry-led initiatives such as bonding, just to understand what the uptake of training would be, looking at those two things. We're also looking at alternative routes into industry. So here in the UK, we have a top-up scheme, if you like, where industry provide a set amount of money, which is sort of ring-fenced for apprenticeships, and government tops that up. So for transport and logistics, we have 39, I believe, apprenticeship standards. And we've just recently developed a first officer pilot apprenticeship standards. I appreciate that, like all government schemes, there are mixed reviews on how that scheme is working. So we're just working through that with industry. Moving on to sort of air traffic controllers, ATCOs has always felt a little bit elusive to me, which is strange because it's a safety critical role. But I've always sort of taken the position that with aviation, there are so many different parts of it. There's your airspace, your airports, your airlines, your regulators. Each needs to keep pace with the changes that are happening to the sector. And we really need a holistic approach, because I feel if one falls short, the sector will find it very difficult to function. I think there's a really important point to note with our airspace here in the UK, that we're doing a complete overhaul of our airspace. So we're doing a complete look and restructure of how we're using our airspace. Our airspace hasn't been looked at for the best part of 50 years, I believe. So this is going to mean we need more air traffic controllers. We potentially need more airspace designers. So we have, again, created an apprenticeship for air traffic controllers, which we hope will create a structured pipeline of ATCOs going into that industry. Brianne, you also mentioned the model that we have here in terms of NATS being part publicly owned and part privately owned. And I think this is a really good model, because it gives NATS the sort of flexibility and the resource it needs, but it gives government that sort of reassurance, and a lot of what NATS do can be called in or approved by our Secretary of State. So I think we've got quite a good balance with that model. And just moving on to MROs, I think there was some comments in there around job prospects being quite low in the UK, partly because of Brexit and because of our relationship with EASA. So, I mean, I think the first thing to say is we've always said that we would seek to continue participating in EASA regardless of our relationship. I don't think Brexit is the main or only factor in this. I can't deny that Brexit is impacting on all sectors right across the UK. But I think with MROs, we have a real social problem, which does nothing to tackle the retirement issues. So if you look in the UK, we've got 53% of the aerospace workforce, which is currently aged over 45. So that is half our workforce retiring roughly at the same time. We need to backfill those jobs. So I think there's a real stigma and stereotype around these roles, which we need to tackle, and quite early on in education. And there's also, I think it's also a bit unclear about where the future MROs are coming from, with changes in licenses and training. I think it's becoming less military and potentially less general aviation. And we just need to think about where those MROs are coming from. I think the other thing to point out as a sort of policy takeaway is last year the government set out plans for a future single skills-based immigration system. So the future immigration system will be introduced from January 2021, and that will be a new route for skilled workers, and the emphasis will be on skills and talent. So I think that's also quite important that we're putting skills and talent up front. I think there's the other thing to say on tackling misconceptions and outdated stereotypes. When I started in this job, I was asked this question, and I ask this question to everyone that I meet. When I say apprentice or when I say engineer, what do you think of? And by and large, most people always say a 16-year-old boy, potentially dropped out of school in blue overalls and a spanner. And that's just not the case at all. And it's those misconceptions and those stereotypes that we really need to start breaking down. I'm conscious that I'm sort of hitting about 5 minutes, so I just wanted to add some final comments on diversity and technology. Diversity is clearly an issue. We have 6% of our commercial pilots are female, 9% of our engineers are female, and that frankly is just not good enough. But there is a real opportunity here to attract underrepresented groups as an alternative to financial incentives. And that's why here in the UK, last year we launched an industry-led charter for women in aerospace and aviation. And we're also looking at gender and race pay gap reporting, because Brianne, as you said, there is a real lack of data here in the UK about the representation of women and BAME. Just on technology, what we're trying to do through our strategy is trying to nudge industry to just come out of that sort of 2 to 5 year thinking and to start thinking a bit more long term about what does technology mean? What does technology look like in the future? Do I need to look for different skills that I look for now? Do I need to recruit in new areas such as cybersecurity perhaps? And we're seeing a lot of technology coming online here. So we're seeing digital control towers, we're seeing electrification, new technology in planes. So it is coming online, perhaps not as quickly as some might argue, but it's definitely on the road, and there is still some confusion about, I say confusion for lack of a better word, but there is still some question marks over how is it really going to impact the sector and what does it mean in terms of the way the sector runs. So those are just some really, really high level comments from me. I will probably leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Jade. We'll turn it over to Seth, your reactions and some of your thoughts about how to move forward.
Okay, I hope everyone can hear me. Thanks, Paul, and thanks, Brianne. Thanks, Jade, for joining in on this conversation as well. I really appreciate this work and the fact that you're promoting this out because from my perspective as an educator in the aviation field, I think with the exception of the pilot shortage, there really hasn't been all that much in the way of exposure and promotion of the fact that we need to enhance our workforce in all of these sectors. So I'm going to take that approach as a person that has overseen comprehensive aviation programs that focus on not just professional pilot training, but students that graduate from any of our 50 or so accredited university programs throughout the United States in air traffic control, MRO, maintenance, airport operations, etc. I really especially liked in the report, and also Brianne, you mentioned in the webinar, that the term pipeline, that we have a pipeline issue rather than a shortage issue. In some cases, I certainly do believe there is a shortage, but that seems to get a lot of political pushback in certain sectors when you maintain shortage. For example, the Airline Pilots Association in the United States has always expressed that they don't have a shortage, they just have a pay issue. And if there was the higher salaries, then we would see more people in the cockpit. The challenge with that is, given our history of retirements, a volatile economic environment over the previous 15, 20 years, even if the airlines decided to raise salaries significantly, we still wouldn't immediately be able to fill the gap because the pipeline has somewhat of a vacuum in there. So I think the term pipeline is really a key factor here. I really did appreciate the fact that this report covers all sectors because it might be the motivation for a more comprehensive aviation workforce policy. I think what we've seen up till now were sector-based addressing of the issue, and those sectors don't often talk to each other, and certainly there is a challenges with coming up with consistent workforce development strategies. Primarily, I think, because in the United States, the ownership structures and the governance structures for each of these sectors is very different. On the airline, MRO, and flight attendant side, that's a private sector issue. Our airlines are privately owned for-profit companies, whereas, and so are the MROs, whereas our air traffic control is a federal government entity. And then in the airport sector, with the exception of the TSA, which is a federal workforce, airports are typically municipally owned or owned by local authorities, but are not federal agencies. And because they're all owned by individual municipalities, there's not necessarily a consistency on how each of those airport sponsors goes through the hiring process. So it's nice to see these all together, and perhaps we can get some more of a consistent strategy. I'll just spend a couple of minutes kind of going through each sector to give my perspective on where we're experiencing pipeline shortages and why, and what has been done on, from a policy perspective to remedy those situations. I'll start with the airlines here in the U.S. The pilot shortage has clearly gotten the most exposure. And I think that's because, at least from an educational perspective, and even just from talking in the public, when someone thinks of, what's a job in the aviation sector, the first and almost the only thing that comes up into people's minds is the pilot. And that's not to say that there are 10 other or more jobs for every pilot that we hire, but pilots seem to have the most exposure, and that's why we've seen the most exposure in the pipeline shortage area. The challenge that we've seen is that it took a long time for the industry to realize there is indeed a shortage, because we did have a flow, a pipeline from military and then from regional carriers and business carriers that were filling the spots of the mainline air carriers as people retired. But in the 90s and 2000s, with a very volatile industry, we didn't see people going into flight training, and we didn't see people going into those types of programs, primarily because they didn't see a return on the investment. Nobody wanted to spend, Brianne, you mentioned upwards of $100,000 to $250,000 in collegiate level flight training, only to get a $20,000 job that might end up, might get laid off in a couple of years due to a volatile industry. That took a long time to get to our situation. So now I think we're starting to see that pipeline starting to be filled with an uptick of enrollments in flight training programs, because the industry has really marketed the fact that they need pilots. We've seen at Ohio State upwards of 150% growth in enrollments over the last 5 years in our flight education program. And that increase is fairly consistent among the collegiate level flight education programs in the country. One of the motivators for increasing enrollments is the fact that the industry is starting to pay in to the system. We're at the point now where the regional air carriers that are feeders for the main lines are becoming actually short of pilots. So now we're starting to see industry-based policy and programming to create formal cadet programs or partnership programs with flight education institutions, which are providing incentives for students to continue and advance their flight training through scholarships, through guaranteed interviews for a position, with also potential seniority benefits to give them higher priority and higher ability to create schedules of their own once they get into the job. So, and salaries have gone up as well. So we're starting to see this. We started to see this uptick in enrollment and incentive programs about 5 years ago. But because we have experience requirements upwards of 750 to 1,500 hours of total flight time, it's going to take a number of years for those students of 5 years ago to get into the regional airlines and fill the pipeline. But we have to start somewhere, and I think that's what we're doing on the pilot side. On the air traffic control side, as you mentioned, we do have a shortage of controllers. In the United States, the FAA did have a program to try to accelerate the training of air traffic controllers through universities, through their ATC, CTI, Collegiate Training Initiative program. That program still exists, but because there's no tremendous benefit towards getting hiring, we start to see a little bit of leveling off of enrollments within there. So there is a real challenge to try to get more, especially a younger generation of professionals into that industry. Recently, the FAA did establish a Center of Excellence for Air Traffic Control, Technical Training, and Human Performance, which is a partnership between the FAA, 16 universities throughout the United States, and industry to develop curriculum and training assessment methods so that the industry can train up more professionals quickly and have higher retention rates so that the pipeline gets filled more quickly and consistently. MRO, as I mentioned, is also a private industry that is having challenges. I do want to mention that it's not just the aircraft MROs that are experiencing challenges, and it's not just Boeing and Airbus. The Embraer and Bombardier And then in the general aviation sector, Textron, Cessna also are having trouble with hiring their MROs. And then also it's other manufacturers such as GE Aviation, creating the engines and all that. That whole sector is having challenges. And I think Jade really mentioned that very well, that there may be still some sort of stigma with respect to the level of education required, and the fact that it may be more vocational than it is higher education. And in fact, I think that's propagated in the United States due to the fact that most of the MRO training programs are vocational schools or community colleges. So I think a couple of policy areas that need to be addressed is the fact that the public perception of these jobs, it's a far more professional job requiring a lot more technology knowledge than ever before, needs to be promoted. And then the idea, and we're working on this at Ohio State, is combining an MRO license, like an or aircraft and power plant license, with an add-on to get a bachelor's level degree now makes those professionals more marketable within the MRO industry. And then I know I'm getting close to my 5 minutes as well, if not going over. I do want to mention the airport environment. I understand that the report was focused on kind of the wage worker professionals. And yet there is a challenge of hiring those. And for the most part, a lot of the airports, if they don't do the hiring themselves, which is typically civil service type applications for these jobs, they will subcontract out to companies that will perform those services for them. And there's a challenge of hiring up there as well. There is a significant sector of the airport industry that I don't think we should ignore, and that is the professional management level and even supervisory level when it comes to either operations or any of the business functions, marketing, finance, customer service, terminal management, and then also planning and engineering. Now, there is a tremendous need for that workforce as well. And the national academies here in the United States has established a number of research programs through the Airport Cooperative Research Program, sponsored by the FAA and the Transportation Research Board, to address workforce development and retention, both on the wage level side and in the professional development side. And those projects are ongoing. So I think that's the lag push, is the airport sector to try to get more people into that workforce pipeline as well. So that's my 5 minutes. I'm really looking forward to the open discussion now.
Thank you very much. We do have a couple minutes for some questions. For those that are online and would like to ask some questions, please use the question function on the GoToWebinar control panel. We'll be combing through those. You know, one that's come up a couple times while both of you were talking was the pay versus pipeline issue. Obviously, that varies from sector to sector within aviation. And one thing that Brianne mentioned was how some sectors have seen significant increases in pay. Pilots were one. I think that Brianne mentioned the airport workers as another, where we've seen some pretty significant increases in pay. Brianne, I don't know if you want to spend just a minute on anything else where you've seen on the pay side. And then, but the question that keeps coming up is, if we have to increase pay to attract workforce, how does that affect the cost of air travel? And what is it going to mean for folks that are flying both domestically and internationally? Brianne?
Yeah. So again, it's there's a variety of different ways that the workforce is being paid, and it depends on the occupation that we're talking about. I think there is evidence that it's increasing in some cases, but that might change over the course of time. I'd be curious to hear from the other two, though, if they've seen anything on this.
Jade, Seth?
Go ahead, Jade.
It's okay. I was just going to make sort of two very small points on that. The question around increasing pay and the effect that it has on sort of travel, I think the first thing to say is the aviation sector is a private sector, and sort of pay and those sort of decisions are commercial decisions for them. The second thing I'd say is And this was one of the points I made in my sort of 5-minute ramble, was that financial incentives are, yes, they're great solutions, but they're not the only solutions. And this is why I sort of mentioned tackling those sort of underrepresented groups. Again, it depends on sort of the reasoning for increasing pay and using financial incentives. But I just really want to make the point that it's not the be-all and end-all of solutions.
Yeah, that's a good point. I would absolutely agree with that there is a tremendous pool of potential professionals that haven't been yet tapped. And that is a key area to addressing the shortage or pipeline issues. With respect to will increased pay affect cost of travel, my off-the-cuff remark would be, at least in the U.S. airline side, the airlines have experienced record profits over the last several years with the economic recovery. And a lot of that has been a result of increased income streams by the airlines, baggage fees and other what they call decoupling of fares, so buying your own seats and all those sorts of things. Airlines will not have profits if they don't have pilots. So some level of investment in the pilot is an important element. And I don't know whether or not that would increase fares, but certainly if there are no pilots to fly the airplanes, the airline won't be generating any revenue. On the airport side, I think any of the sectors where there requires some technology, there is certainly competition from the tech sector. It's hard to hire someone who's well versed in technology, computer systems or IT, for a $50,000 a year job fixing air traffic control technology when they can get far more than that at a private sector. One of the issues that can be addressed is the fact that the aviation industry has become a lot more stable in terms of hiring, in terms of reduction in layoffs. So I always encourage students that are looking in two different areas is you could go into tech and you may have a great job now, but this is the industry may collapse. You may lose your job in 6 months, but the aviation industry is a lot more stable at this point. And the idea of encouraging those workers to enter a field that they can have a longer career might be an incentive.
Got it. Thank you. So next question is, there's some worry that we've seen, and this, some other folks on the line have seen that we, meaning either private sector or the government, will spend a lot of time and energy and money to train workers to have them either leave for other countries or for other sectors. What have you guys seen in terms of attrition outside? So, for example, in the UK, you could train a pilot and have them, then leave for another country in Asia or Africa and fly there, basically expending resources to then have that pilot not fly in the UK system, and vice versa in the US. Say you've got a company like Boeing that spends a tremendous amount of energy training an engineer to only have them go work for the automotive industry or something like that. What do you guys think about that issue, and how has the industry been reacting to it? Jade, we'll start with you and then go to Seth.
Go ahead, Jade.
Okay. So to be completely blunt, I think competition and the risk of professionals taking their skills elsewhere, that is always going to be a risk. But there is something that we can do in terms of retaining our professionals and understanding the sort of needs of professionals. And I don't think this is just a UK thing. I was in Montreal with the International Civil Aviation Authority in February. They, at a global level, understand that there is some real sort of challenges in terms of skills and deployment, and retaining professionals is one of those. And the UK was participating in the global strategy that ICAO want to develop in order to not only recruit and educate our next generation of professionals, but also retain them. So I think my very high level takeaways to that sort of question would be, yes, there is always going to be that risk. We can mitigate it as much as possible, but there will always be that risk there. I think it's sort of understanding the skill need is understanding what you're sort of offering to your professionals, and just making sure that our package to retaining our professionals is sort of where it needs to be. But that's a very sort of high level off the cuff comment from me.
Yeah, so similar for me, I have kind of a high level what I've seen in the industry from kind of the academic perspective. We see both United States citizens and foreign students coming to our universities and tech schools to get trained, not only to be a pilot, but to do other technical and professional jobs in the aviation sector. Quite honestly, I don't see a significant amount of U.S. citizens, either professional pilots that are being trained or other professional technical skills, leaving the U.S. for other countries to work in their aviation sectors. I do see most of the foreign students coming in either individually, or universities have programs with other countries to get larger volumes of students into their flight programs. I do see them going back to their countries. On the non-pilot side, on the technical side, what I do see are foreign students that would like to stay in the United States to work for the FAA in air traffic control, or work for certain airports. But there tends often to be a barrier, and that is a citizenship requirement. And so one of our policies that we might want to look at is, how strict should citizenship requirements be for certain jobs in the sector? Because with those requirements, we are creating a risk of not hiring enough professionals in certain sectors.
Great, thank you both. So the last question that we have time for is one that comes up an awful lot, and that's kind of taking a view outside of our insular field, which is aviation. And this paper, of course, was focused on aviation, but what lessons from other sectors can we take into account when we're thinking about the aviation workforce? What have you guys been using as case studies or interesting anecdotes or other kind of recommendations for similar industries that have gone through similar workforce challenges? And what lessons can we pull from those examples? And again, we'll go with Jade, and then we'll end with Seth, and then that'll be the conclusion of the webinar.
Okay. Without trying to get too granular in the detail of what we're doing here, last year when I started in this role, I was very keen to start looking at sort of wider sectors and different modes to see what the sort of challenges were and where there were clearly some alignment. Examples would be speaking to the maritime team here in the Department for Transport. I understand that they have very similar issues on the sort of safety and security side, and also issues with diversity, hence why we sort of piggybacked off their ideas around having a charter for women in aviation and aerospace. On sort of apprenticeships, because apprenticeships for me is a really good alternative route into the industry that we can do a lot with. And I've been looking at the agricultural sector and the fisheries sector to understand sort of what they do in their areas, just because some of their roles have some seasonality to it. And that's actually an issue that crops up a lot for me with industry around sort of seasonal businesses. I've also sort of looked to rail. So in the UK, without getting into too much detail about it, we have, I say, quite an intricate model and system for rail in terms of the regulator and the private owned sections and the publicly owned sections. So I've been having a lot of conversations across modally, but also in some of the other environments, in the environment policy and the health policy, to sort of think about how we're tackling cost barriers, how we're tackling our apprenticeships, how we're increasing the number of students in STEM skills, how do we sort of break down those cultural and stereotype barriers, and how we're sort of dealing with technology coming online and also representation of women. So I think cross-modally, there is a lot that we can learn from a UK perspective.
Yeah, and in the United States, we've been looking to see how we can improve our training practices in all sectors of our aviation field, like we've talked about here. Areas such as tech, they are very innovative in bringing down to academic institutions what their needs are in the workforce. And it's a very quick turnaround to create curricula, have industry partnerships for innovative learning, and very adapting to changing technology makes it a lot more feasible and actually desirable for graduates to go into that field. Whereas most of the training requirements in all areas, whether it be pilot training or air traffic controller training or MRO training, are still subject to very 20th century requirements as dictated by the FAA. And that reduces the ability for us to innovate in our training. And then another sector that we look at are all the other public sector agencies that have challenges in hiring, and it's primarily due to the hiring practices of civil service in the public sector. There's not the innovation in recruiting or going out there to job fairs or doing anything else that they can to market themselves as being good, viable employment opportunities. So those are the two things. We're looking at kind of the positive areas in the private sector and the challenges in the public sector to see where we can find that sweet spot to get the professionals we need into the aviation industry.
Great. Thank you. Well, we are out of time. I really appreciate both Jade and Seth taking the time to call in today, providing a tremendous amount of insights. Thanks again to Brianne for presenting the paper. We did not get to all of the questions, so those of you that did ask a question and did not get answered, we will be following up with you. Thanks again for everyone for calling in. We're going to continue this discussion in other formats as we go forward and we try to tackle this issue. And we look forward to seeing you on the next webinar. Thanks, everybody.